Hi, I'm Michael Forney. I'm a designer for Microsoft Teams, and I'm here to tell you all about extensibility on the Teams platform. Today we're going to walk through some design guidelines for building on top of the Microsoft Teams platform. To get started, let's talk about our experiences. Teams is really about an immersive experience. We have activities, chats, meetings, files all in one place. And the idea really is to have the conversation and keep the user in the flow. To do that, we've got personal apps where we roll up all of the services into one place for the user. Tabs and conversations. So what is the conversation about? And can I have a browsable UI that's associated with that conversation? We use instant notifications. We have a stage view where we highlight task-based content, and we also have a mobile experience. We use a bot framework, and that is how you're going to communicate directly with your users. Messaging extensions where users can query directly against your entities. And we have a whole set of customizable cards which make the content much more than just the bot talking to someone. It's talking about this object. So let's talk about the framework. The first part of the framework to understand is content and conversations all in one place. And really the best place to do that is within a tab. Tabs are a great place for you to highlight your content in a full, rich, immersive experience. The focus functionality part of tab is really isolating out the task at hand as opposed to embedding an entire portal. One of the things that we talk about a lot is reducing the need for sort of a tab pancake. So if you have tabs, remember that your tabs are sitting underneath our tabs. When we talk about reduced Chrome, for instance, what we're really getting at is eliminating as much of that extra navigation experience, and to remember that our experience is a subset of your entire service. Tabs are conversational, and the thing that I always ask developers to think about is what is the conversation about? And the conversation can be about a group of things, an individual object, a collection, something that has state and sits in time. But if I were to start a conversation around your tab, what am I talking about? And if it requires several points of navigation to do that, the other people that are in that channel are not going to understand what you're talking about because they'll have to navigate there too. Tab layouts really cover a wide gamut, so we can use a single canvas like a Word document. We can do multiple columns. We do this for Planner as an example. Lists, sort of like our files, a grid, and grids are incredibly useful, but I do recommend that if you're going to use large cards that you're dealing with 10 or less items because it's just a much easier interface for users to navigate. Best practices are always to include a default state. So when anyone lands on your tab, what is the thing that everyone should see? Deep linking is something that we do a lot of, so a bot can deep link directly to a tab. And then making a good name for your tab is super helpful so that users aren't always trying to figure out what to call the tab for all the other users in their organization to understand what the tab is, this word that sits on top of the conversation, what that tab actually is doing. Visual style for Teams, there's a style guide that's out online, and there's a control library that we've released. It's very helpful if your tab uses the same type ramp, is using some of the same colors so that we're not disorienting users once they drop in. Bots. Everybody wants to do a bot, and let's start talking about bots. So the first step for a bot is to introduce itself, and we really refer that as the value proposition. The best way for a bot to tell us what its value is to tell you exactly what it does. I often encourage people to have a tour for their very first part of the experience, or allow users to opt into a tour. And this is a really good example of where I might use a carousel card. We'll talk about cards in just a minute. Having an unauthenticated experience is also quite useful. So when I ask a user to sign in, what is the value that I am going to offer you in exchange for your username and password? As you start thinking about your bots, having a name is quite useful, but also think about the avatars that you're using. So if they're too muted or have a transparent background color, it's going to be very difficult for users to understand which bot it actually is. So let's talk about how you represent your bot to the user. This is an avatar. So the bot will have two different icons that you'll be able to ship with your manifest. Your color icon should be relatively contrasty. Remember that Teams has, at the moment, 3 different themes that your bot will render against. This hexagon also indicates to the user that it's a bot and not a person, and they can see that from 16 feet away. Buttons can be used within the cards, and I do recommend that you send cards. We'll talk more about that later, but not just relying exclusively on conversation is incredibly useful. When we're talking about conversation, let's talk about how to fail forward with your conversation. So the best part about a bot is it can respond to a variety of different entries. If I were to say, hi, help, thanks, how will your bot respond? Really thinking about all the failure points is incredibly useful. And this is where I often dust off an analogy. If you've ever remodeled a kitchen, you know that you can tear out the cabinets really quickly, you can put in new cabinets, and then at some point you get hungry and you slide your stove into place and maybe jury rig a sink so that you've got access to water, and you can actually make dinner. It is not a place that you want to hang out. The same is very much true for building a bot. It's very easy to get things going and not use natural language processing or to do any kind of entity tuning. But once you start doing that, it's that last 20% of fine tuning that really makes a bot a place that people are willing to hang out. I break these into 3 different sections: recognize questions, things that you know that you are listening for. I'm listening for my entity name, let's say task, and all the different ways that I could say task. And it's incredibly useful as well to find multiple people in your organization that come from a variety of different backgrounds. Another example I would use is my daughter texts me quite often, and if I were to ask her to text me, I might say TXT, SMS, message, and all of these different things are effectively the same thing. These recognized questions are things that you are listening for, that you're going to have a response for. Recognized non-questions are things like hello and thank you. We were very surprised when we first started working with bots that after getting a good result, we were getting a lot of responses that said thank you. And our initial response to that was, I don't know what that means. Please try again. So understanding that what people are going to say is incredibly useful. Then there are unrecognized questions. In other words, your cat has just walked across the keyboard. How will you respond to that? Almost all of your non-entity questions, it's very useful to guide the user back into the flow of what your task is. And I often use the example of the unflappable librarian as this. At one point, I worked in Portland and watched a young librarian take a transient's question of, do you have beer in this library? Without blinking an eye, she responded, we don't have beer, but beer reference is in 900 sections, and you can find out all about the different styles of beer in this section, et cetera, et cetera. So by taking this seemingly odd question that she could have no answer for, she turned it back into the task at hand, which is finding books in the library. This is very much the same for bots. Your personality matters a lot, and so you can have no personality, and we've seen bots like that. Their workaday, they work on scripts, they can be incredibly hard to use because there's just no personality with it. You can also go way too far and act as a class clown. In general, I avoid trying to do either of these. This sort of central place where the writing really maps directly to your brand and how your service speaks to users is very, very important. And being consistent with that persona is incredibly useful. Lastly, how often should your bot reach out to a user? And this is a question that we get a lot. My recommendation is really only when you have to. So what we want to avoid is getting over-notified to the point where we get notification blindness. If you have a lot of things that you need to tell your user, consider things like a digest, which you send once a day, or changing how you send that notification. You can tell the user that there are 4 things that they need to know about, and then pass them into a tab. Bots have tabs. This is a big difference between us and other bot platforms, and the reason that they have tabs is because users sometimes have more complicated things than they can get done with a conversation. An example that I often use with this is when we talk about multi-turn interactions is finding some time with Michael. I would like to book some time with Michael, and the bot's response might start off with, which Michael? There are 400 Michaels in Microsoft. There are probably more. And then I would say, oh, Michael Forney, fantastic. Where would you like to meet? I would like to meet at the Microsoft main campus. What time would you like to meet? 1 o'clock. Michael Forney is not available at 1 o'clock at that time. All of this could have been solved with very little request from the user and interaction by having a dialogue. And a dialogue can be hosted in one of two different ways. One is in something that we call a task modal, where we host your UI. And the second is directly inside of a tab. If you have entities that you're constantly interacting with, host them in a tab next to the conversation. Use a conversation as a way to quickly query or to notify users, and redirect them into the tab for your bot. In general, bots are not assistants. They have very focused functionality. They work best if the task range is the task scope is relatively narrow. I encourage you to discourage chit chat. Unless your bot is absolutely about just having a conversation, chit chat will circle people around and not get them to the task at hand. Have some personality, but don't overdo it. Maintain your tone and think about when you're going to send cards and that they're not too huge. Keep an easy task flow, and this is one of the huge advantages with bots. In the example where I said, let's schedule some time with Michael, I could have said, next time you can schedule a meeting with Bob at 1 o'clock tomorrow on Microsoft main campus, all in one utterance, and the bot would understand all of those different parameters as opposed to having to ask for each individual parameter to fulfill it. Sharing content, one of the best ways to share content is using message extension. Message extensions are an excellent way for users to inject a very specific entity from your service into the conversation. How does that work? Well, I open up the message extension like I would, for instance, a Giphy. I can search directly against your content, find the entity I'm looking for, and then inject it into the compose box, have a conversation around it, and then users can reply to that in a thread even. One of the things that we do recommend you do is keep your parameters relatively simple. So a single parameter query, for instance, the title or the work item number, is preferable to title plus assignee plus the subject matter area, all in one query that you would have to enter. We also encourage you to limit the card size, mostly because the bigger these cards are, the more they're going to obfuscate the conversation around them. But it is a relatively straightforward process, and this also works with our command box at the very top of our UI. Keeping it simple, you're going to hear me say it a lot: optimize your search results, optimize your cards, and one of the most important things I would recommend is if you have a notion of recent interactions on your service by that user, providing a default query as opposed to a blank canvas where the user doesn't know what they're going to get. Now let's talk about cards. Cards are one of the most visual elements of your service, and it's a great way to inject a specific entity into a conversation. From a bot perspective, the first thing that you'll have is this opportunity to inject envelope text. And this is just the conversational element, the free text that's outside of the card. Keep in mind that most people won't actually be reading a lot of that because your card is so visual, their eyes are going to go directly down to the next element, which is the title. The title and the subtitle are rendered on the top of the cards. In this case, this is a hero card. The image, your text area, buttons, and then the entire tap region that you specify, which then each one of these has an action. The types of cards that we have are based on the different frameworks that exist within Teams. Both the hero and the thumbnail card are part of the bot framework. The hero card can have a relatively large image, but if you don't use that image, then it will reduce its size down to just the text areas. Thumbnail card uses the layout that's much more horizontal with a small thumbnail image. Do be aware that if you send a very, very large image, we're just scaling it down. We're not resizing it, and therefore you may end up with some bandwidth issues on mobile scenarios. The connector cards have been around for a while. They're part of the 365 connector set. We do support them. My recommendation, however, is that you start using the adaptive cards, which are far more flexible and have a much richer interaction. You can use column sets, data sets, expand them for forms, have forms that are static in the card that you submit. And lastly, there's the sign-in card. And this is not very malleable, but if your service requires an additional sign-in and we're not passing through, your bot will actually surface this card as well. Card collections are as varied as the card frameworks. So the carousel is part of the bot framework and navigates from one card to another in the set. I do caution you on scenarios. So carousels are excellent for scenarios where I'm discovering the next thing as opposed to looking through a list of things that I have to select and evaluate one against another. A carousel scenario might be, here are 5 foods that you should be eating, and the first might be blueberries. Ah, I like blueberries. What's next? Broccoli. Not such a fan. What's next? Cabbage. Why all the cruciferous vegetables? But each click of that carousel shows me a new card that I had no idea was coming. List views are far better for trying to figure out, to disambiguate between one option or another. I love the digest card. It's one of my favorites from the connector series, which is on the right. And Teams has created a card that we refer to as our list card. This is actually scrollable on the desktop view and supports up to 15 items inside the list. Lastly, there's something that we call bubble merge, which is effectively your bot sending 3 or 4 cards in rapid succession. I love this approach for things such as I'm going to send a hero card, which is probably the best answer to the query that the user had, but there might be 2 more options or 2 more results that you might want to surface but not pay as much attention to. In the case on the right, it's a hero card followed by 2 thumbnail cards. I do encourage you to keep the noise down. Don't send lots and lots of cards. Remember that users are trying to have a conversation inside of the channel. The size of those cards can be quite huge, and if you're blocking users from seeing the conversations around those, you're going to make your users very unhappy. Test these on mobile, not just for the size of the cards, but especially if you're injecting anything custom into your cards, making sure that it works on the 2 mobile environments that we support. And avoid putting text in your graphics. It's a classic accessibility no-no. There's no way for a screen reader to see that text. And remember that the graphics are going to be sized down on the mobile screens significantly. Keep in mind also that your cards can be a subset of the entire entity and that you can always hand off for a full entity to either a web page or a tab. The activity feed is a place where we're going to get notifications. There's a task list where our updates happen that your app will actually be able to communicate directly to the user when things have changed using either the bot notification or the app framework. Let's talk about personal apps. It's a great place for you to bring all of these different capabilities together in one place for a user. I'll use Planner as an example. Planner has a conversational element where the bot can notify me of new tasks that are assigned to me. It also takes advantage of Recent and All, which is an API we expose to allow me, the user, to see all the recent tabs for that service that I visited. That's very useful because as a design manager, there are tasks that are associated with my employees, and I review those in the Teams settings themselves, but looking at the recent tab in my personal app gives me a quick set of links to go into those channels without having to hunt and peck. All is simply all of the tabs that exist that I have access to for your service. We'd like to see help as well, and settings is also an opportunity. One of the big things that I always promote with personal apps is you should have at least 3 usable tabs within personal apps before you try and submit this. That's about it. Thanks a lot. Hopefully you learned something about how to think about designing for Microsoft Teams.